Please don't hit me again." The words hung in the diner air like steam from a pot left too long on the stove. They were small. They were heavy. They landed before the sound did, a thin, brittle thing, a child's plea, spoken by a woman used to swallowing everything else. Maya felt the slap as if a fist had taken pieces of the night with it. The mug trembled in her hand, and coffee fanned across the formica in a dark, hot arc. The smell filled her nose. Burnt beans, metal polish, the faint copper tang of too much salt from old fries. The diner, at 1:45, had the tired hush of a place that had seen too many days. The neon sign out front hummed and flickered, painting the linoleum in an insistent red. Carver's chair scraped back. Shoes hit tile. The sound cut a line through the silence. Heads turned in small increments. Not quite curiosity, not quite conscience. The man who had raised his hand to her was broad and familiar to everyone in town, a local with a short fuse and a long sense of entitlement. He did not care about the way he made people feel. He did not need them to forgive him. Maya pressed her palm to her cheek as if she could hold the skin together. Her other hand kept a hold on the mug out of habit for the work of the night, even while coffee cooled in it. The booth smelled of old syrup and vinyl. There was an old handkerchief folded in her apron pocket, a square of thin cotton stitched with the initials R.W., and under the hem a small tear that her mother had mended into silence. She felt it there like a heartbeat. Ruth's handkerchief, always in a pocket, always a small, warm thing to touch when the world was too loud. No one moved. There was the turkey of silence that showed how practiced they were at looking away. A waitress dropping a glass would have sprinted to clean. A fight would have been a spectacle to be gossiped over till the next day. But this was not spectacle. This was a private injury in public. It required moral muscles nobody wanted to flex. From the counter, a fridge hummed. A neon clock said 11:42. Outside, the town's main drag stretched toward the mills and the pines beyond, dark and indifferent. Maya tasted metal. Her face stung in a way that made the taste linger. Someone coughed. A spoon clinked. The radio murmured a song about summer, and it sounded obscene. Then a man stood. He was not large in the way that measured threat and masculinity. He was ordinary, in faded jeans and a coat that suggested both economy and intentional simplicity. He walked with a steadiness that made the room feel small around him, as if his motion created a new axis for the evening. He stopped at the booth, looked at Carver, then at Maya, and said, as if reading the room's moral ledger out loud, "That's enough." He placed a $100 bill on the table without fanfare. He did not ask for his change. He did not take a side in the way of men who wanted a story to tell later. He did a simple arithmetic of human decency, paid the check, and walked out into the night. Maya sat frozen. The bill sat there, a bright rectangle against the chipped laminate. Carver muttered something and shoved back his chair. His back hit the door with a dismissive thud and he left, as if nothing had happened. The diner resumed its measured breathing. People went back to their coffee. The radio kept talking about summer. She heard her own labored breathing like a small animal's. The handkerchief in her apron pocket was suddenly the only thing she could sense. She lifted it and pressed it to her lips. It smelled faintly of lavender and starch, a smell she'd known since childhood. Ruth's handkerchief had been folded into the apron of her mother for as long as Maya could remember. Ruth had always carried things like anchors, coins in a pouch, a small butter knife wrapped in twine, the handkerchief with the faded initials. The man who had left the money paused under the diner's neon sign. He did not disappear into the night like some anonymous benefactor in a story. He stood a few steps from the curb and looked back at the lit window. For a second, his face was a map of something older, memory, or grief, or both braided together. Then he turned and walked away. Maya kept her hand on the table as if the world might be steady if she owled it. Her apron was damp and smelled of grease. The tiny crowd of late-night regulars gave her the courtesy of continued indifference. She cleaned the coffee more slowly than necessary, each motion a prayer to speed. She stuffed the handkerchief back into her pocket as if hiding it might hide the ache. The next morning, the town would have a story to tell. By noon, the story would have a nicer ring to it. A stranger stepped in. By evening, the stranger would have a name. By the next day, the stranger would be sitting in her booth. If this is speaking to you, like and drop your town in the comments. He returned not as a savior, not as a conquering saint, but as a quiet repeat. Charles Remington came back to the diner with the same plain coat, the same measured step.
He sat in a booth toward the back, where the lights softened, and the coffee came black. He ordered eggs and asked where the pie came from, as if he had been coming there all his life, not because of one strange night. He watched without watching. He was not a man who needed applause. The regulars noticed him and filed the sight away like a bookmark. When Maya took his order, she moved around him the way she moved around every regular, polite, practiced, precise. She did not know what to do with the bill still in her drawer, with the strange reprieve it had bought from the previous night. She had stared at it under the counter until it felt unreal, like a prop in someone else's life. He left a business card when he finished his coffee. It was simple, embossed with the name Remington Ventures, and a cell number that had an almost private ring to it.
On the back, in careful pen, he had written, "For Maya, RW saved me. Please call." For a long time, Maya held the card between two fingers like a relic. She had no idea what it meant that someone from a town 2 counties over would know her mother's initials. Ruth Williams had been quiet in the neighborhood, the kind of woman who lent sugar and mended curtains, who worked at the diner the way noon became afternoon. Ruth was not famous. She was not loudly heroic. She had been the kind of person who held a place together not for recognition, but because she could not stand to leave it broken. When Maya was a little girl, Ruth had taken her by the hand and taught her to fold napkins the way the diner preferred, corners tucked, edges lined, and to listen to the habits of people. Ruth had kept a small notebook with addresses and birthdays and the names of everyone who had ever wanted a little kindness. The handkerchief had been one of many little prophecies she left behind, a note sewn into life that said, "I was here. You can be here too." The call came on a rainy Wednesday, the sort of day the town slowed down and the diner baked cinnamon in the oven to keep warm. Shelves steamed. The smell of the wash from Ruth's old apron seemed to hover in the back room like the memory of a hymn. Maya's voice on the phone was measured with the kind of politeness you learn when your life requires you be calm for others. She did not expect Charles at all. "Miss Williams?" he said when she picked up. His voice had a careful way of landing. It was soft but firm at the same time. "My name is Charles Remington. I sat in the back last night. You don't know me yet, but your mother, Ruth, saved my sister and me from a fire when I was small. I wanted you to know that before I said anything else." The words were small and enormous at once. Maya's chest felt like a coiled rope. She had known her mother had done strange, inexplicable things. There had been hospital visits and quiet late nights, a piece of a story Ruth had told uncleared by time, a photograph of a building gone to flame with a name barely legible in the corner. To hear the name spoken by an outsider was like a bell. It released something in the town that had long been a soft, patient grief. He wanted to meet, he said. He wanted to hear what she thought should happen to the place that had been Ruth's last job. He wanted to talk about the future. He came as if sent by old debts. When he arrived at the diner that afternoon, he did not sit in the back. He asked to sit where Ruth used to sit, at the booth nearest the window. He unbuttoned his coat and folded it across his knee as if he were settling into a conversation that would be long. "There was a fire in the mill quarters," he began, as if opening a door to a room he had not entered in years. "My sister and I were 8 and 6. We were asleep. The smoke woke us." There was a woman, about 50 years old, wild hair, hands like work gloves, who pulled us out of the back of a building. She wrapped that handkerchief around our faces. It had lavender. I remember the smell. I remember a small woman holding my sister and me until the firemen came. She wouldn't let go of our hands until she knew we were whole. He touched the folded handkerchief in his coat pocket, as if he could recreate the scent. For a moment, his private past was visible like a photograph. "Ruth Williams," he said. "She told me to look for work and loyalty, boy. She said, you get a job, you don't forget people who help. It's a strange debt to hold for 30 years. Maya watched him. The handkerchief in her apron pocket thrummed like a secret. She did not leap into gratitude. She had a life that required hard, small decisions, and she had not been accustomed to the language of owedness from a stranger. She was a mother. She had to weigh what it meant to accept help, in a world that taught her endurance as the only currency. He was not imposing. He asked questions with pauses that gave space. He asked about the diner, who cooked the pies, who did the accounts, what the regulars liked. He wanted to know whether the place had a back lease and whether Miller, the owner, paid his taxes. He asked whether Maya wanted to talk about moving on, about better pay, about a place that was safer and treated its staff as people. She had time to say no, time to say yes. People will say a man with money just wants to buy sentiment, Maya said finally, because she had to say something that would anchor the conversation to reality. They'll say he wants a story for his charitable giving. I don't know you. I know Ruth saved people. I know the handkerchief. It doesn't mean I owe you anything. He looked at her, a small, honest look that was almost apologetic. I don't expect you to owe me. I expect myself to owe her. If you want, I would rather do this under the terms you think fair. I want the place to be Ruth's, not mine. That sentence did not make the decision for her, but it made room. It made room for a different kind of possibility than silence had offered. Miller watched all of this from the doorway in his slow, neat way. He had owned the diner longer than any of the young staff had been alive. He swept his cap off like a man who had given his life to keeping things the same. To Miller, change felt like loss of authority, and he had little use for a stranger who reminded people of small things: kindness, decency, debt. When people began to ask whether the place was for sale, Miller's face tightened. He could imagine losing not just a building, but the story of his own small reign. The process moved with the plodding seriousness of legal work. There were papers to be read, a title check to be requested, a meeting in Miller's office with the same laminated desk pad that had seen more cigarette burns than he would admit.
Charles arrived with a lawyer, not in the way of men who threw checks on tables and walked away with banners. He arrived with a stack of documents and an offer that included not just money, but terms that specified legacy, a plaque recognizing Ruth's years of service, an initial endowment for staff training, and, critically, Maya repeated one afternoon in Miller's office. Her voice was low. The air smelled of coffee and dust, and something that meant decisions. Not at all, Charles said. I'm asking you to tell me how to make this right. Maya felt that he said it with a sincerity that made her anger less loud and her skepticism more honest. She went home and unfolded Ruth's handkerchief on her kitchen table and watched the sunlight pick out the initials. Ava, her daughter, scraped crayons across the paper at the other end of the table and hummed without a care. Maya watched the little curve of Ava's brow as she concentrated, and then she thought of nights when she had kept both of them fed and warm, and the nights when she had simply held on to the notion that if you were steady enough, everything might not collapse. Giving up the diner to someone with money could look like selling out. It could look like acceptance of the very classed distance that had let Carver feel entitled to strike her. But there was another frame, handing the keys to a community anchor to people who would promise to honor that anchor. The ledger that matters, she thought, is not one of how many bills you can lay on the table. It's about who sits at it. When Charles made the offer official, signing the papers at Miller's insistence, ink on dense paper, witness signatures that made the transaction legal and real, he did not sign with flourish. He signed with a quiet hand. He left the diner that day with a file folder under his arm, and the new banner over the front window the next week read in simple letters, Ruth's Table, under new management. There were no drums. There was only a flurry of local reporters, and headlines that called it the Billionaire's gift in a tone that made Maya bristle. In their accounts, the narrative tried to compress the years of layered dignity into a single check. It was easier for the town to believe in a savior than in a shared pledge. Maya called a staff meeting in the back room. There were 4 or 5 of them clustered around a scarred wooden table. Clara, who had once worked 2 jobs and slept on the couch above her cousin's garage. Julian, who took care of his elderly father and could fry the best scrambled eggs in town. Samira, who had come from across the state with a suitcase and a stubborn laugh. They had watched the sign go up with the same mixture of hope and suspicion as the rest of the town. Their hands were calloused.
Their habits were formed of shifts and overtime and paying for school when a scholarship would not. I didn't take anything because I liked the sound of a rich man's press release, Maya said. She spoke plainly because she could not afford to pretend. I took it because Ruth did what she always did. She saved people when she had to. And the man who says she saved his life says he wants to make right what she started. Clara's eyes narrowed. So what does that mean for us? More hours? Less pay? New rules? It means we get paid a fair wage. It means there's a day program after school for the kids. It means we don't take a man's slap as the price of tip anymore. Maya kept her voice even. She had rehearsed these words in front of the mirror because the idea of commanding a room full of other people's livelihoods terrified her. It also means you get to help design what this place is, not him, us. Samira laughed a little, incredulous. Not him at all? Not entirely him, Maya said. He has money, he has influence, he is offering it. That doesn't give him the right to make this a show. You will write the policies, not a boardroom in the city." Julian folded his hands on the table. "And if the town hates this? Then we keep doing the work anyway," Maya said. "We stay open to the people who want help. We give them a meal and a job and a chance to be seen." The room felt heavy and full at once. They had been invisible for so long that being seen felt both dangerous and liberating. Word spread. News from out of town called Charles a billionaire who had come to save a small diner. Social media did what social media does. Snippets, angles, opinions that turned a subtle human exchange into a spectacle. The camera loved a simple story. The story the cameras liked did not like nuance. Not everyone cheered. Some neighbors grumbled that the town had traded its dignity for a press release. Others feared what change might bring: higher rents, different faces, a gentrification that exchanged the town's old warmth for a curated nostalgia. Miller staged his resistance in small ways. He took longer to hand over keys. He combed through the lease with the sharp eye of a man defending the last piece of his authority. He argued over the placement of the plaque that would acknowledge Ruth's service. He asked thorny questions in public hearings. Who would pay for the renovations? Was this a commercial venture or a charitable project? Who would benefit if the town's heart was transformed into a brand? Councilwoman Constance arrived in a wool coat and a stack of pre-written statements. Where she saw a policy decision, the town saw a person who smelled political advantage. Her questions were framed in procedural language, but they carried the undertone of a gatekeeper. "We need a full disclosure," she said in the town hall meeting. "We must make sure our tax dollars are protected."
Her eyes slid over the room and landed on Maya with a cool computation that Maya's cheeks flush. Constance spoke of due process and transparency in a tone that might as well have been a challenge. "Who put you in charge?" Maya learned quickly the grammar of this kind of public life. People came to demand to be heard and to register their fear as a civic virtue. Newspaper op-eds had their angle: charity or commerce. A local talk radio host read the business filings in a tone that pretended he knew what a man with money might intend. There were late-night phone calls with anonymous voices that whispered suggestions of what could happen if the town changed. There were petitions, and there were quiet notes slid under doors in the dead of night. "Change this, and you break everything." Through all of it, Charles only asked two things: that Maya choose, and that he be allowed to do what his conscience required. He insisted, repeatedly and gently, that if he had a debt, he would repay it in ways that honored Ruth's name. He did not offer a solution that sufficed to heal everything. He offered a partnership that would require work. Maya found herself not only attending meetings but making decisions. She signed the employment contracts that restructured wages. She set up the after-school hours. She insisted on a hiring policy that preferred locals. She took phone calls from parents who were nervous about their children's futures. Each small choice felt like a step on a long staircase. She learned to ask what the town needed, not what she thought the town would like to hear. Clara, Julian, and Samira began to show up not as nameless staff, but as people with agency. Clara took responsibility for outreach and began phoning local churches and nonprofits. Julian negotiated the new kitchen schedule so that no one would be forced to cover double shifts without notice. Samira found the supplier who could bring the pies back to the taste they'd always been. Their micro-wins stitched the dream into something usable. Maya carried Ruth's handkerchief every day in her pocket. It became a talisman and a measure. When she felt small, she would touch the thread and remember her mother's hands. One evening, as they spread blueprints on the counter to reconfigure the dining area, Charles reached across the paper and touched the handkerchief where it lay. "You keep that close," he said. It was not a question. His voice cracked, barely. "I remember the smell." She watched him fold the corner of the plan, smoothing a crease with a finger that moved as if tracing something familiar. In the background, the town murmured with its own judgments. Then the first threat arrived. At first it was a smear on a column in the local forum, an anonymous comment that called the change a takeover. Later, someone left a letter in the mailbox behind the kitchen, a single sheet, words printed in block letters that read, "We don't want your kind here." It was unsigned.
It used the language of many small hatreds: protectionism, fear, and the rhetoric of preserving what we have. The night before the renovations were set to begin, someone had broken a window at the back door and thrown a rock with a note wrapped around it. The note said, "Leave it as it was, or face what comes." Maya found the rock in the trash the next morning. The glass glittered under the sun like spilled sugar. Ava had not seen it yet. She was at preschool with a paper crown on her head and a glue stick smile. Maya's stomach knotted.
"Is that vandalism?" Julian asked when he came in and saw the light through the shattered glass. "It's a warning," Clara said, her voice low. "It's people showing who they are before they hide behind polite words." Maya picked up the rock with care, as if it were fragile. It was not. It was ordinary, heavy, used. It had been chosen for its weight. On the way back to the kitchen, she felt the eyes of the staff on her, the way they looked when they expected her to have a plan. For the first time in years, she felt a public pressure she had not anticipated. It was not just about surviving a shift. It was about running towards something bigger and trying not to break. "We will repair the window," she said finally. "We will board what needs to be boarded, and we will not let them make this about fear. We will clean up and open on schedule. We will show up." "You're sure?" Samira asked. Her laugh was brittle. "Aren't you scared?" "Of course," Maya said, "but fear doesn't get the votes here. Action does." They boarded the glass that day, and they set up a simple camera over the back door. It was an act that felt equal parts practicality and defiance. Everything about the choice felt like a test, for the staff, for the town, for her own capacity to lead. Miller called to complain that the town was being disrespected. Constance sent an email requesting a hearing. The radio host turned the story into a morality play, with a line in which he asked what kind of town would allow an outsider to change things. The words stung. They were designed to be sharp. And in the quiet between those moments, Charles would come in late and sit at the booth. He would sometimes bring a thermos of tea and talk in small declarations that felt like vows. He was there in ways that were not performative. He would talk about the fire, a quick memory of heat and the handkerchief, and a small woman who had smelled of starch. He would ask how to make a schedule fair, how to hire staff without imposing his taste, how to fund a scholarship for a kid who wanted to learn to be a cook. He was learning to let go of his assumptions. He had money. He knew how to make decisions from that vantage point. What he was discovering, slowly and awkwardly, was that handing over power required more listening than speaking. When he tried to order renovations without Maya's nod, she corrected him.
When he insisted on a plaque that read his name in the grant section, she put a stipulation. The plaque would honor Ruth and the staff, and any acknowledgement of his contribution would be discreet. At night, after staring at floor plans and the neat lists of materials, she would lay her head on the pillow beside Ava and imagine months from now when the noon rush would come in and children would pile into a corner table for free milk because someone had set aside the money. She imagined an elderly man who had lost his job finding part-time hours at the diner. She imagined a board where people from town would mount their notices about lost dogs and upcoming chamber meetings. She imagined the bulletin board as a living thing. But change does not move linearly. The town is a web of habits. Habits have defenders. One afternoon, as Maya walked into the kitchen with a box of new plates, she found Miller waiting at the back door. He held the keys like an accusation. "You signed on with him," he said, not as a question. "You sold out." "I signed on to a plan that pays more and treats people like people," Maya replied. "This isn't about him. It's about making work hold someone up instead of wearing them down." Miller's mouth tightened. "You think money solves everything? You think you can buy hearts?" "I don't think any of that," Maya said. "I think money buys things that allow dignity to be practiced. It doesn't do the practicing for us." He walked away with a hiss of indignation and a left-behind resentment that smelled faintly of the older ways, authority without accountability. The town's old guard felt betrayed that the habit of accepting certain indignities might end. It is always easier to keep the world as it has been than to do the complicated work of reweaving it differently. At night, the streets hummed. The boarded window made a promise to the future. We will not be cowed. The board also bore a new, low-cost security camera, a small black eye that blinked quietly into the study place behind the diner. Then a late-night footage review showed a shadow. He was not a stranger, the grainy pixel suggested. He moved like someone who knew the back alley and where the cameras didn't fully see. When the image blurred to a sweatshirt and a hood and a fist, Charles leaned forward and said the kind of sentence that could have been a prayer or an ultimatum. "We find him." Maya thought of Ruth's small hands, of the handkerchief pressed to the faces of children who had been pulled from smoke. She thought of the man who had left $100 on a table and then returned days later with a memory that made his life tilt. She thought of her own child's crayon scrawl and how quickly innocence is met by the world's weight. That night she slept for an hour and woke with the feeling of responsibility in her chest like a steady pulse. She had said yes. She had said we'd stay.
She had said we'd build Ruth's table into something that fed more than appetite. Now the question was, when people showed their teeth, how would the town respond? Would it circle its own wounds, or would it stand? Morning came with a smear of gray light. The boarded window had a new note tucked beneath the slat, folded like a secret. Maya found it with numb fingers. The note had no signature. "You don't belong here," it said. "Be gone." She kept it folded and put it in her apron pocket beside the handkerchief, like two small relics from the same history, one of kindness, one of hatred. For a long time she stood in the quiet kitchen that had once been Ruth's domain, and she let the sounds of the place wash over her, the clink of spoons, the hum of the grill, the distant beep of the register. These were ordinary sounds that anchored her. If someone had told Maya a year prior that she would be negotiating with a councilwoman, signing legal papers, and standing between intimidation and a group of people who needed a meal, she would have laughed in that dry, anxious way that a mother learns. She did not seek authority. Authority had sought her, as if someone had pulled on a thread, and she could no longer refuse to unravel a small part of the town's worn fabric. Charles came in that afternoon and placed a small plain box on the counter. He had that look again, the one like someone who had remembered a small kindness and could not forget it. He sat and watched the staff move like a conductor watching the orchestra getting used to a new score. "You asked me to be part of it," he said softly, "not in the way of a monument, but in the way of keeping the heat on and the ovens working. I know money can't undo what happened. It can only help make the conditions for dignity. I'm prepared for a long season." Maya unfolded Ruth's handkerchief and placed it between them. The initials looked like the faint ghost of a signature. She thought for a moment of the fire, of small hands being wrapped, of what it means to be saved and then to live under a debt. "We work on this together," she said. "You do what you promised. We do the day-to-day. You listen. We make mistakes. We keep the doors open." He nodded. Outside, a car idle. Voices began to gather, and a camera light blinked in the distance. The town was waking up to the fact that it would be asked to choose whether it would be a place that tolerated cruelty for the sake of sameness, or one that accepted the harder work of change. One night, as they were closing, a man stood at the neon-lit window and watched them. His face was pale in the glow. He had the tired look of someone who had spent his life keeping his head down. He came forward then and slid a piece of paper across the counter to Maya. "My mother used to eat here," he said. "She taught me manners. She also taught me that when someone is in trouble, you stand up." The paper was a letter, folded and creased. It read simply, "I saw your courage."
"Keep going." Maya read it twice, then folded it into the pocket of her apron above the handkerchief, between two truths, that some people turn away, and some people, sometimes the quietest among them, step forward. They repaired the window with a thicker pane. They made a plan for night shifts, with 2 employees always present. They called Sheriff Granger, who promised an extra patrol for the week. He was not flashy. His presence was a small grid of steadiness. He listened when Maya told him about the anonymous notes, about the rock. He did not make grand promises. He offered the kind of practical support that felt like being given an extra set of hands. Miller grew more isolated. He staged a scene at the town store where he complained about the sign placement for all to hear. He wanted respect. He wanted his authority. But as more people walked through the door to sign up for shifts, to write letters, to volunteer at the after-school program, the culture began to turn microscopic edges into something rougher and more resilient. The day they hung the first small plaque, not the gilded thing reporters wanted, but a quiet brass plate near the kitchen door, a handful of townspeople came. Helen Blackwood, who had once taught Sunday school and whose donations mattered little, but whose voice mattered much, came with a casserole and a smile. She stood at the doorway and said, "Ruth fed my mother when she couldn't feed herself. We don't forget where we came from." It was not a flood. It was not even a parade. It was a smattering of small gestures that, together, began to look like a pattern. They were the sorts of acts that did not make a headline, but bent a town's arc the tiniest degree. Maya stood and watched her staff refill plates, and saw in their hands the first signs of a new rhythm. The menus changed in small ways. 2 healthier options, a family's meal special, a scholarship jar. They put up flyers for literacy classes, and a notice about a support group that would meet in the back room on Thursdays. The diner became more than a place to eat. It became a small node of care. But shadows did not vanish. The night they found a spray-painted slur on the alley wall, the words stung like salt. Someone had climbed an act of anonymity into public malice. The sheriff took prints. The footage from the new camera that watched the back door provided fuzzy evidence of a visitor in a hood. "He's local," the footage said, when they enhanced it. "He moves like he knows the place." Maya looked at the screen and saw a silhouette that might have been Todd Brennan's shape if one were generous with the outline. Todd was a local who had skirted trouble before, an unhappy echo of the town's resentments.
He had been around. He had an old grudge against Charles, or maybe against change itself. His name had been whispered by neighbors who remembered drinks and small cruelties.
This was the first time that the town's anger felt like a physical thing they had to address, not a rumor to be ignored. It was the kind of test Maya had been bracing for in the quiet moments when she hugged Ava to sleep. They called a staff meeting. They called a community meeting. The idea was to show up, to make their presence a kind of answer. Maya wrote a small speech for the town hall, felt her throat tighten at the thought of standing before a microphone, and then rewrote it until her voice felt steady. In the end, she realized that the rest of the town needed to see her stand before they would stand themselves. Her body would be the sample of something workable. Her courage would invite others to be brave in small ways. The neighbor who left casseroles, the parent who signed up to supervise the after-school table, the elderly man who volunteered to sweep the back lot. They were writing a new script, and no one could be certain how the scenes would end. For now, there were small victories and new threats. The work ahead was long. Maya folded Ruth's handkerchief, smoothed the fold between her fingers, and carried it in her pocket like a small, steady light. Sometime that week, as the first crews arrived with paint and plywood and a cadence of hammers, she stood at the diner doorway and watched. The smell of fresh paint mingled with oil and coffee, and life felt like it was unrolling like a carpet that had to be scrubbed yet again. Charles stood beside her, a quiet presence that did not overshadow her. He handed her a wrench, and for a moment the cliché of him as a man with a checkbook went silent in the face of the real, mundane labor. "Where do you want the bulletin board?" he asked. "Near the counter," she said. "People should be able to see it while they're ordering. It should be a place that becomes a habit to look at." He nodded, and the next day a carpenter hung the board. People began to tack on notices: lost cats, church suppers, a child's piano recital. The town's small life began to writhe into the space that had once been merely functional. But in the margins, resistance gathered. A heated phone call to Sheriff Granger referenced an arson rumor that had no proper footing yet. An unsigned letter slid under the back door the week after the paint dried. It had been folded twice, pressed into a narrow slit, as if the author wanted the message to be private, even as they hurled it into public life. The words were blunt, typed on a cheap printer. "Keep out, or we'll make you regret it." No signature, no business, just a threat that sat heavy in the morning air like a smell you could not wash away. They treated it like evidence. Maya put it in a folder, labeled it, and put it on the small metal shelf with other things that had become part of her new work: receipts for the pain of class, the printed result of the security camera footage, the signed employment agreements. Small piles of ordinary proof that someone was trying to make their life small. Sheriff Granger took the matter seriously, in the practical way he took most things. He organized, he listed, he scheduled. He walked the back alley with Maya one morning, the sheriff's boots crunching on gravel, and he asked questions with the soft steadiness of someone who had seen towns lurch through worse. "Threats," he said, "should make you wary, not quit. We find footprints, we talk to people, we do the legwork." It was legwork that mattered. The footage they'd collected from the newly installed camera was grainy at first, little more than blotted shapes. But a team reduced the fuzz, lifted a silhouette from the night, and then, with small procedural steps, matched a gait, an angle of shoulders, a way someone slipped across the frame. The sheriff called it a match. The name that followed over the police radio made Maya's stomach drop: Todd Brennan. Todd had been an open secret in town for a long time. He had a temper, he had debts, he drank. He had also, for reasons that ebbed and flowed, been on the receiving end of the diner's charity on more than one occasion. He had left a trail of threats before, and his resentments were a kind of local folklore that people preferred to treat like a cautionary tale rather than a live wound. The sheriff's men came in the afternoon. They moved with paper and procedure: a warrant, a respectful knock, the rustle of coats and evidence bags. They took Todd in for questioning. For Maya, the moment of seeing the man pass loosely through the diner doorway, escorted by uniforms, felt less like cinematic justice than a small and brittle relief. He pleaded deniability at first, then began to talk when confronted with the footage, with the witnesses who'd seen him wandering at odd hours, with the receipt that put him into town at the critical times. Todd's voice in the station had been a mix of defiance and the soft unraveling of a man who had run out of easy stories. "You don't understand what this town is," he said at one point, his jaw tight. "This place is protected. We keep it as it was." He named no one specifically, but the implication hovered like cigarette smoke, a group of people who believed themselves guardians of an old order. Under questioning, Todd admitted to the window break in the graffiti, the intimidation.
small acts that had been meant to send a message. But the sheriff and the deputies had also gathered more. Neighbors who had seen him near the mill quarters, a bar receipt that put him at the place earlier than he had claimed. He had been careless. When the films were shown to him, the careful stacking of facts made confusion crumble to confession. Arrest is less a dagger than a cordon, a binding of action and consequence. Todd was taken in, processed, and charged for vandalism and for making terrorizing threats.
In the days that followed, the local gossip turned to quiet questions about motive and about the reasons someone might think their town belonged only to certain people. Miller, for his part, watched the whole thing from a distance, and then, like many who had been slow to shift, found himself moving toward a place he had not expected. He came into the diner one gray afternoon with his hat in his hands and the posture of a man carrying more weight than the mail on his tongue. "I don't know how I could have seen it and done nothing," he said to Maya, standing in the doorway as if the words had taken shape inside him. "I thought I was holding the town together. Maybe all I was holding was the parts of myself that wanted to be the one in charge." The apology came small and human. He did not make it a grand speech. He did not ask to be taken back in immediately. He set a hand on the kitchen pass and admitted that he had been afraid of losing his sense of place. He said he had been wrong to assume that staying the same was the honorable choice. It was not a movie moment. There was no musical swell and no spotlight. Maya gave him neither immediate absolution nor a public rehashing of his failings. She accepted his apology as a necessary small thing, and later, in private, asked him to help once he had thought about what help looked like. That was the modest form of redemption the town could bear. Acknowledgement, then work. The town hall meeting they had feared now took place under a square of harsh lights and a dozen chairs that smelled faintly of old varnish. People gathered with petitions, with questions, with folded placards, and with the friction of a community negotiating itself. Councilwoman Constance defended procedure with clipped sentences and a stack of documents. She insisted on a public hearing about the tax implications and the terms of the transfer of the diner. She asked for financial disclosures and a plan for name recognition. The town was turning the personal into the administrative, because that is how a community makes things manageable, on the record with minutes and votes. Maya rehearsed her speech in the car. She had written it on a notebook Abby had given her as a child, and she had begun to keep a small journal of decisions and conversations titled, simply, Ruth's Table, Year 1. The speech was short. It was steady. She refused to be drawn into moralizing. Instead, she placed the story of the diner in the context of everyday needs. "I am not here to give you an elaborate promise," she said at the microphone, voice clear in the room. "I'm here to tell you how we will make this work. Fair wages, hours that don't eat people's lives, an after-school corner for kids, a board with people from town to keep oversight honest. I won't ask you to trust me immediately. I will only ask you to come by, to see what's different, and to hold us accountable." Her words landed, then warmed. Some dozen people clapped, some did not.
That had been expected. The council asked questions about liability and about whether the endowment Charles had set up included clawback clauses and community oversight. Charles sat in the back, hands folded, the business card in a wallet like a map to a memory he didn't want to forget. He answered procedural questions respectfully, deferring where he had no business. "We will adopt whatever oversight makes the town comfortable," he said when asked about transparency. "We will create a board with townspeople. I will not be the one setting daily policy." He kept to that. When Constance asked whether the contribution meant Remington Ventures might seek naming rights or other privileges, he demurred. "My interest is in making the place sustainable," he said. "If a plaque is needed to hold memory, let it honor the people who have worked here. Ruth, the staff. That's my condition." The council voted. It was not a landslide, but it was decisive enough. The transfer would stand, subject to oversight and a community board. The vote felt like a hinge. They had moved from rumor into regulation, from fear into structure. That night, Maya drove home with Ava asleep in the back seat, crayons tucked in the pocket of a jacket, and she thought about how thin the line is between courage and the exhaustion that follows it. There was a quieter test that came after the legalities were settled, a surveillance of hearts. People began to show up in small ways. Helen Blackwood visited with a casserole. A retired teacher offered reading help for the after-school program. People who had once turned their backs started to bring in pies and casseroles and apologies over iced coffee. A small woman who had once been a regular began to volunteer on weekends, citing Ruth's kindness as her reason. Each act was a stitch. The staff found its rhythm. Clara's outreach had brought in a local nonprofit that offered free counseling to employees.
Julian began training a young cook for professional certification. Samira set up a pie rotation that honored old recipes with a healthier twist. They made space for Ava's crayons on a low shelf, and for a little jar where people could donate toward a child scholarship fund. Inside the diner, the light changed. It was not simply aesthetic, but moral. People rotated through the windows and left with the sense that this place had been altered from within. But when the reconstruction was nearly complete and the doors had been rehung with fresh lacquer, someone tried something worse. The attempt to set fire to the back of the building arrived on a Thursday after closing. It was not a cinematic blaze, no dramatic hunks of flame licking the eaves. It was by intention smaller and therefore more insidious. A pile of old rags set near a trash bin, a small blaze sparked and then smothered by the quick reaction of a night custodian and Sheriff Granger's late patrol. Smoke curled and then stopped, like a breath held and then released.
The sprinkler system had not been compromised. The fire had been small enough to be an attempt rather than an all-consuming act. The aftermath smelled of smoke for days. The sheriff treated it as an attempted arson. The footage was clearer this time. The person who moved in the frame was less careful, the hood drawn but the gate familiar. Todd Brennan had already been in custody for the prior threats, but this time Todd's confession was not simple. He refused to admit involvement in the arson attempt, and the sheriff widened the probe. It turned out there were accomplices, voices behind the scenes who had egged on acts of intimidation. Subtle ties were uncovered, bar tabs paid in small cash, a delivery of supplies to a nearby lot, messages passed among the usual suspects. Court paperwork filed, and the town watched as justice, slow, clunky, legal, worked. Arrests were made, charges filed. Todd was linked to the break-ins and the graffiti. A neighbor's description provided the missing piece that anchored the blurry footage to a name. The arson attempt yielded more responsibility than the man who had tossed the rag. It exposed a network of resentment. A legal closing of this matter did not erase the damage, but it allowed some breathing. It made accountability visible. That visibility mattered in a town that had once been comfortable with silence. In the weeks that followed, there were more unexpected conversations. Miller, who had stepped back from authority, began to attend the weekly staff check-ins. He would sit quietly at the edge, and then offer something concrete, a discount on used kitchen equipment he no longer needed, or a conversation with another alderman about keeping property taxes stable. He did not come back as if nothing had happened. He came with the humility of a man who had watched his town change and decided to be part of that change in the only ways he could. Councilwoman Constance, too, changed shape. Her public posture remained procedural. She asked about budgets and long-term plans, but privately she made a call to the small school principal and arranged a partnership for vocational training in the diner kitchen. It was not a grand conversion. It was a practical step. She still wanted the books balanced. She thought like an office holder. But she too began to measure worth by actions rather than the reactive fear that had once guided her. The media headlines softened. They stopped shouting, "The billionaire saved the diner," and slowed into longer pieces that chronicled the after-school program, the living wage policy, the board made of local names. Reporters came in the first month with cameras and left with notes about the jar for scholarship funds, and a woman who had been in the kitchen since she was a teenager and now had training toward a culinary certificate. The story the paper liked most became the small, steady scaffolding of people who had chosen to keep showing up.
The day of reopening arrived with a light rain that made the neon sign blink gentler than usual. They had decided not to stage a ribbon cutting that would look like a corporate flourish. Instead, they asked those who mattered most, neighbors who had eaten at Ruth's table for decades, the volunteers, the teachers, the sheriff, to come for the early seating. They placed the small brass plaque, plain and modest, near the kitchen door. It read simply, "In memory of Ruth Williams, for those who feed and are fed." Maya stood with Ava on her hip as people trickled in. Real customers, old and new, took up chairs. The menu had a few new items and a few old ones made kinder to modern appetites. The coffee tasted like beans warmed with care. Clara took names and handed out flyers for the after-school program. Julian hustled in the kitchen like a man who had finally been given room to do his best work. Samira's pies came out with a steam of fragrance that was almost holy. Charles stood by the counter, not fronting but present. He had learned to sit in the wings. He watched as Maya signed the petty cash log, then the volunteer roster, then the schedule for the scholarship drawing. He watched as she asked a new volunteer to learn how to take inventory. For him, sitting there was a private reckonings. To have been given a life that could be tilted by a small handkerchief, and to have learned that influence mattered when used to amplify others' choices. A small line formed, people took their food, conversations began and hummed. The town's life, in its modest and stubborn ways, restarted in a new configuration. Months slowed from the initial rush into a more deliberate pattern. They held a public anniversary for Ruth, a simple thing with coffee and candles. A plaque was unveiled, and Ava placed a small paper flower beside it. Maya read a short passage she had written, not to preach, but to tell the town what the place had become. "This is not a memorial that keeps us looking backward," she said. "It is a reminder that there are debts you cannot pay in money, debts of attention, of kindness, and of staying. My mother taught me this. We will honor her by being a place where people are seen and given a fair chance to work and to learn." People listened. Some prayed softly, others nodded, others clapped. The handkerchief felt heavier in Maya's pocket than it had months before. She unfolded it in private later that day and smoothed the initials as if touching them could slow time. Charles, who had been the instigator of a change, felt himself changed in ways he had not expected. He reduced his visits to occasional lunches and meetings. He attended board meetings but made clear his role, funder with no dominion. The more he withdrew from daily authority, the more he found the life he had altered translating into a new form for him, not the life of transactions and solitary decisions, but the life of a partner who listened and who bore a memory like a compass.
He started a small foundation that supported similar locally owned projects while insisting that those grants be stewarded by local boards. He began, in quiet, to mentor younger people, not from atop a pedestal, but beside them, learning to ask questions rather than dictate answers. He did not become a saint. He still had the memory of his own small debts and the ache of that night in the fire. But the arc of his days changed. He began to take regular hours volunteering at a community nonprofit that taught basic job skills. He spoke less at galas and more at kitchen tables. The debt he had carried for Ruth's act became a lifelong thread that altered how he measured success. Maya's leadership continued, not as a trophy but as a task. She kept a notebook that cataloged meetings, problems, and small victories, a donated freezer, a grant approved for apprenticeship training, a neighbor who had been skeptical but now volunteered on Saturdays. The staff grew in confidence. Clara enrolled in bookkeeping classes and took on payroll. Julian signed up for an apprenticeship program with the vocational school. Samira found a supplier who sold local fruit at better prices. These micro-wins accumulated like pennies, and a few months later the ledger didn't simply show dollars, it showed dignity. They had another small crisis, a funding shortfall when a promised grant was delayed because of paperwork. It was not dramatic, but it forced the board to decide to run a fundraiser that asked the town to invest in itself. Maya stood at the mic in the community center and asked for small donations, for casseroles to be auctioned, for people to donate hours of labor. The evening raised more than money. It raised a curiosity in people who had earlier considered the project an outsider's fancy. It changed skeptics into participants. The plaque by the kitchen door acquired an extra charm, a folded scrap of fabric tucked beneath it, a piece of Ruth's handkerchief that someone had taken to stitch a little square to the plaque's edge. It was a quiet act of devotion, not ostentatious, and it suited the place. Movies love tidy ends. Real life prefers the ongoing. On the first anniversary of the reopening, Maya wrote in her Year 1 notebook a single line, "We are here." Then she folded the page and wrote in the margin, "Keep showing up." She brought Ava to help hand out cookies. She sat at the counter for a few moments and watched Nan, an ex-regular who had once been standoffish, speak softly to Clara about an opportunity to host a monthly senior lunch. There were no fireworks. There was a long line at noon, and the smell of coffee steamed like a benediction. A woman who had once been a neighbor and an opponent left a note on the bulletin board, "Thank you for not leaving." It was the kind of small message that in a single line reversed the arc of months. Maya kept the handkerchief in a small glass case on the shelf now.
It was not on display to seek sympathy, but to remind the staff, and herself, of the lineage the place carried. The business card that had once felt like a relic sat in a tin labeled "Letters." She kept it for the record of how an act of remembering had shifted things. The plaque near the kitchen glinted in the late light. The town's daily life continued. Children came for after-school programs. The scholarship jar had a set of names tied to it. People sat in booths and read the paper, and argued about the weather, and swapped recipes. A minor miracle happened not as a blaze, but in moments. A teenager learned to make a pie and got a part-time job. An elderly man found a reliable hour of work that kept him moving and fed his sense of reason. When journalists asked Maya whether she owed everything to Charles, she shrugged with the quiet that had become hers. "He helped make the opening possible," she said, "but the work is ours. He showed up, we stayed. That is what made the difference." And when Charles, on the rare evenings he allowed himself to be reflective, sat alone and thought back to the night of the fire, to the smell of lavender on a ragged square of cloth, and to the woman who had wrapped a child's face and held on, he admitted to himself that his life had been altered not because he had purchased a building, but because the memory of debt had been made living again. He had answered an old obligation and found himself shaped by it.
The city dinners he once attended with a smoothly curated agenda now sounded thin against a life filled with the rhythms of actual human work. There was a private moment on a cold morning when he stopped by the diner with a thermos and found Maya sitting at the back table, Ava at her feet, a crayon-sketched drawing of the diner on the table. The handkerchief lay between them like an open book. He sat quietly and listened as Maya talked about the next phase, a training program for young adults who had dropped out of school, an agreement with the vocational center, and a plan to start a tiny mobile kitchen that could reach parts of town farther away. "You have changed more than the diner," he said softly after a long pause. "You have changed how I measure my time." Maya looked at him without sentimentality. "You helped make room," she said, "but we did the work. Don't forget who keeps the tables clean." They both smiled in the way of people who shared exhaustion and an odd kind of joy. He left with a small stack of notes in his hand, names, phone numbers, a list of potential donors for the apprenticeship fund, and a sense that the world had narrowed into clearer lines. He had not fixed everything. He had not made people whole, but his response had altered the pattern of his days. He would carry Ruth's debt as an act of responsibility, not a smudged memory. Years later, the board would meet and talk about replication, how to help similar grassroots projects without imposing.
Charles would sit in those meetings and remind himself to take the longer view. Maya would still be at the head of a staff meeting some days, asking about schedules and community outreach and whether the scholarship jar had enough for the latest applicant. She would still fold the handkerchief and smooth the initials with a finger when the night was quiet. She would still be the person who decided to keep showing up. On a quiet evening, while Ava drew a line of people around the diner with crayons, the way she imagined the world, Maya wrote one more note in her journal. "This is a beginning, not an arrival." She paused and underlined the sentence with a shorthand scratch that meant, "Keep going." The handkerchief in her pocket felt like a small, warm proof that even the tiniest acts could ripple. If the headline wanted a single frame, the wealthy man who arrived to change a town, it had it. But the real story had more frames: the kitchen, the chairs, the little jar for scholarships, the board meetings, the busted window repaired, the volunteer who showed up on a Tuesday because he had received a casserole and a listening ear months ago. The billionaire's response had been catalytic. It made an opening. But the work that followed, policy, hiring, listening, teaching, kept things from collapsing into a myth. Maya looked out the window one late afternoon at the people who had gathered for soup and conversation, a mix of those who had once turned away and those who had always been there. She held Ava's hand and felt the small, steady pulse of a life that had shifted from merely surviving to stewarding. If this story has touched you, subscribe and share a moment when someone stood up for another. Stories like this are how communities learn to keep showing up.